Two very different warnings are converging over the west coast of the United States right now, and it's worth understanding exactly what's real in both of them, because one is an atmospheric event unfolding in real time, and the other is a slow-moving geological risk that's been quietly building for years. Together, they paint one of the more unsettling pictures the region has faced in a while, even though, and this matters, they are not actually connected to each other. Let's start with what's happening in the sky, because it's the more immediate, visible story. A major pattern shift has locked a dangerous heat dome directly over the western United States. As the jet stream bulges dramatically northward, a large area of high pressure has built in behind it, and as that ridge strengthens, it pushes the jet stream itself out of the country entirely, shoving it up into southern Canada. That's the exact mechanism meteorologists watch for whenever they're bracing for an extended, punishing heat event, because once the jet stream gets displaced that far off, it's normal. Track. The region left underneath essentially loses its escape route from the heat. With the jet stream shoved out of the picture, storm systems that would normally interrupt a heat wave within a matter of days simply have nowhere to enter from. The high pressure sitting underneath just holds its position, and as it does, sinking air compresses and warms the surface further with each passing day. This particular event has already pushed widespread temperatures into the upper 90s and low 100s across the Rockies and into eastern Oregon and parts of California, with the interior of the region, including Montana, Wyoming, Utah, and the Dakotas, seeing highs approaching 105 degrees Fahrenheit. What makes this specific pattern genuinely dangerous rather than just uncomfortable is the duration. Heat domes tend to intensify the longer they sit in place, because there's no incoming weather system available to break the cycle of trapped, compounding warmth. In several parts of the region, temperatures have climbed toward 112 degrees, conditions officials have described as deadly for roughly 10 million people, particularly those without reliable access to air conditioning, and for anyone spending extended time outdoors. Interestingly, and this surprises a lot of people, areas directly along the immediate coastline have actually been somewhat spared the worst of it, since onshore flow from the cooler Pacific continues offering at least partial relief right along the shoreline, even as inland regions bake. This isn't an isolated event either. It's part of a broader pattern that's played out repeatedly across the country this year, with heat domes essentially flipping back and forth between the eastern and western halves of the United States as the underlying jet stream configuration shifts. Attribution research, examining a previous heat dome earlier this same season, found that the specific combination of extreme heat and high humidity involved would have been virtually impossible without the influence of human-caused greenhouse gas emissions layered on top of the natural blocking mechanism. That's the honest scientific through line connecting this year's repeated heat dome events. Not any single mysterious cause, but a well-understood atmospheric mechanism becoming measurably more intense on top of an already warmed climate baseline. Now, let's turn to the second story, the one unfolding far beneath the surface rather than up in the sky, because it's been building for considerably longer and deserves just as much genuine attention. Earthquake researchers studying the West Coast have spent the past year publishing a steady stream of findings that collectively paint a more complicated, more concerning picture of the region's seismic risk than scientists previously understood. The centerpiece of this research comes from Oregon State University, where marine geologist Chris Goldfinger and an international team of researchers spent years analyzing deep-sea sediment cores representing more than 3,000 years of geologic history. Their findings suggest that the Cascadia Subduction Zone and the northern San Andreas Fault may be more closely linked than anyone previously realized, with evidence indicating that a major Cascadia earthquake could trigger a subsequent quake along the San Andreas Fault within hours, or even minutes rather, than the years or decades scientists once assumed might separate such events. The evidence for this connection comes from a genuinely fascinating piece of geological detective work. Researchers found matching sediment layers formed by underwater landslides typically triggered by earthquakes, sitting at both fault systems and dating to strikingly similar points in time. One particular sample, taken near an area called Noyo Canyon, close to the San Andreas Fault, showed an unusual, seemingly backward structure that puzzled scientists for more than 15 years before they finally understood what it meant. Evidence consistent with the Cascadia earthquake's effects arriving at that location before a subsequent, closer San Andreas rupture added its own sediment layer on top. The implications of that connection are genuinely sobering for emergency planning across the region. As the study's lead author put it plainly, a single earthquake on either fault alone would already draw down emergency resources from across the entire country to respond effectively. If both faults ruptured together within a short window, cities including San Francisco, Portland, Seattle, and Vancouver could all find themselves facing a genuine emergency simultaneously, compressing what would already be an enormous disaster response challenge into an even tighter, more overwhelming timeframe. Separate, more recent research has added another layer of concern to this picture. Scientists using an underwater tectonic observatory called the Regional Cabled Array, a network stretching more than 550 miles of cables and instruments off the coast of Washington and Oregon, have been measuring subtle seismic noise hidden within the Cascadia Zone that traditional monitoring had never been able to detect. That research allowed scientists to identify strain quietly accumulating in the northern portion of the subduction zone, an area researchers have described as unusually silent compared to similar subduction zones elsewhere in the world, like those responsible for major earthquakes in Chile and Japan. That silence has historically made Cascadia particularly difficult to study, since the fault simply doesn't produce the frequent smaller earthquakes that scientists elsewhere use to understand exactly how a fault is behaving beneath the surface. The last major rupture along the Cascadia Subduction Zone struck in the year 1700, producing an estimated magnitude 9. Earthquake and geological evidence suggests these mega-earthquakes recur roughly every 300 to 500 years, a range that places the present moment firmly within the window. Scientists consider geologically plausible for the next major event. There's a genuinely fascinating parallel body of research worth understanding here too, involving something scientists call episodic tremor and slip. Deep beneath the locked, dangerous portion of the Cascadia Fault, there's a separate zone where the tectonic plates slide past each other slowly and silently without producing the violent shaking of a normal earthquake, releasing their built up stress gradually over the course of roughly 2 weeks at a time, repeating on a cycle of about every 14 months. Scientists first identified this phenomenon a little over 2 decades ago, and they've spent the years since trying to understand exactly what triggers and modulates it, since a better understanding of this slow, silent process could eventually help reveal how stress is loading onto the shallower, locked portion of the fault, where a genuinely damaging earthquake would actually originate. Remarkably, researchers have found that this deep tremor activity responds to forces most people would never think to associate with earthquakes at all. Published research has documented that gravitational tidal forces from the moon and sun measurably influence the timing of tremor activity in Cascadia, subtly modulating when these silent slip events occur based on the same forces responsible for ocean tides. Other studies have found that massive earthquakes occurring on the opposite side of the planet, including a magnitude 8.6 event in the Indian Ocean, sent seismic waves traveling all the way to Cascadia strong, enough to measurably increase local tremor activity as those waves passed through the region. That level of sensitivity illustrates just how finely balanced the stress conditions are within this specific portion of the fault system, responding to forces as far away as the moon and as distant as earthquakes on the opposite side of the Earth. If you're finding this kind of grounded breakdown of what's actually happening genuinely valuable, go ahead and hit that like button. It makes a real difference, helping this channel reach more people who want honest context instead of vague, alarmist headlines with no real explanation behind them. Now, here's the part of this story that deserves genuine clarity, precisely because it's so easy to accidentally imply something that isn't scientifically supported. There is no established scientific mechanism connecting a jet stream blocking pattern or a heat dome sitting in the atmosphere to earthquake risk deep beneath the Earth's surface. These are two entirely separate physical systems. One governed by atmospheric pressure and temperature, the other by tectonic stress accumulating along fault lines many miles underground. Researchers studying Cascadia have documented genuinely subtle triggers capable of nudging deep tectonic tremor, including tidal forces from the moon and sun, and even seismic waves traveling around the planet from massive distant earthquakes thousands of miles away. But a summer heat dome sitting in the atmosphere simply doesn't carry anything close to the physical force required to meaningfully influence stress on a fault system locked dozens of miles beneath the ground. So why does this video put both stories side by side at all if they're genuinely unrelated? Because both represent real, actively developing risks facing the exact same region of the country at the exact same moment, and understanding each of them clearly, on their own terms, matters considerably more than pretending they're secretly connected for the sake of a scarier narrative. The heat dome is an immediate, visible danger you can feel and measure today. The earthquake risk is a quiet, longer-term danger that doesn't announce itself with rising temperatures or darkening skies, which is precisely why the research behind it deserves just as much attention, even though it never shows up on a weather app. For residents across the West Coast, the practical takeaways from these two very different stories are genuinely distinct as well. For the immediate heat dome, that means checking on elderly neighbors, staying hydrated, limiting outdoor activity during peak afternoon hours, and understanding that relief along the immediate coastline doesn't necessarily extend very far inland. For the longer-term earthquake risk, that means making sure your household has a basic emergency kit, understanding your specific region's evacuation routes if you live near the coast in a tsunami inundation zone, And recognizing that preparedness for an event that could strike with no advance warning whatsoever looks fundamentally different from preparedness for a heat wave you can watch building on a forecast map days in advance. At the end of the day, the West Coast is currently facing two legitimately serious risks worth taking seriously: a punishing, climate-intensified heat dome playing out in real time overhead, and a steadily growing body of seismic research suggesting the region's earthquake risk may be more interconnected and more consequential than previously understood. Treating both honestly, on their own scientific terms, without manufacturing a false connection between them, is exactly what responsible coverage of genuinely serious risks should look like. It's worth remembering, too, that neither of these stories is really about a single dramatic event happening on a single day. The heat dome will eventually break down as the jet stream shifts back toward a more typical configuration, just as it has repeatedly throughout this unusually active summer. The earthquake research, meanwhile, isn't predicting an imminent date or a specific week to watch. It's steadily refining scientists' understanding of a risk that has always existed along this coastline, simply with considerably more precision and nuance than researchers had access to even a few years ago. Both stories are ultimately about improving how well-prepared communities are for realities that were always going to eventually arrive in some form, whether that's the next extended heat event or someday the next major rupture along a fault system that has been building toward it for centuries. If you want to keep tracking both of these developing stories, the atmosphere overhead and the fault lines below, along with the real research behind every headline before it becomes tomorrow's viral clip, subscribe to the channel so you never miss an update. Stay cool, stay prepared, and I'll see you in the next one.